mean, I said this to Zelensky. I said one of the fathers of Ukrainian nationalism is surely Vladimir Putin. And he laughed and he said, I would not put it that way, but I see your point. I think there is truth to that. You take those two things that happened in the 1990s. One, imagine if Chernomyrdin had just, been, and two, they had not gone crazy on the Chechen war. I think Russia could have had there was a very reasonable chance that Russia could have developed in a very different way. What happens if Putin dies? Nobody knows. There are no institutions, there are no practices, there's no norms, there's no structure of authority.
Hello, my name is Mikhail Ziger, and every week I'm speaking to the unique guests. And today I'm going to interview Fareed Zakaria, who's one of the best-known American authors, political scientists, and journalists. Hello, Fareed. Thank you for your time, and let's discuss something we can be sure about: the post-Putin world. How do you see the post-Putin world? Do you think that the liberal world could become stronger after that war? Because normally you are very optimistic about that.
Yeah, I actually think that in a weird way, Putin's invasion of Ukraine has strengthened the liberal world outside that he regards as his great enemies more than anyone could have imagined. Because, in a way, it has made people understand what they are for. It's always difficult for liberals because you don't have as glamorous or sexy an idea that you are in favor of. What you're in favor of is a rules-based system, liberal democracy, freedom of press. These are procedures, so you're not saying this is the best idea. You're saying we have a system that we believe in. But what Putin did was he made liberals aware of what they're against. And in a way, sometimes you figure out what you're in favor of by figuring out who your enemies are. Look at the Europeans. They are acting with greater unanimity, with greater cooperation. Look at Europe and the US, more collaboration than you've seen in decades. Look at countries like Japan and Australia and Canada and South Korea and Singapore, all joining together. Now, I know there are parts of the world that are not, for sure.
Yeah.
India,
I want to start, but not the list. Brazil, most of Africa.
But let's be honest, those have never been core parts of the kind of liberal world, if you will. If you think back to the Cold War, there was always this middle, these third world countries, they were called in those days, because people forget, was the first world was the Western liberal world, the second world was the communist world, and there was the third world. So we have the return, in a way, of the first world being the Western world, the second world being Putin and maybe a little bit the Chinese alliance, and then there's a lot of people in the middle. But what it's done is it's given the liberal world a kind of energy and a unity that it has lacked. So I think now so much is still to be determined. Who wins in this struggle? Will the Western world be able to stay united? But I think your basic point is correct, that ironically, Putin's invasion of Ukraine has done more to strengthen Ukrainian nationalism than anything could have been prior to that.
To create Ukraine.
To almost create. I mean, I said this to Zelensky. I said one of the fathers of Ukrainian nationalism is surely Vladimir Putin. And he laughed and he said, I would not put it that way, but I see your point. I think there's truth to that. But the second is a certain kind of Western political and civilizational unity of saying, yes, we now understand what we are in favor of, because those core values are being threatened by what Russia is doing.
About 7 years ago, you've written a book named Post-American World. Is that still relevant, or
Yeah.
Do we have American world back, or America is retreating from?
Right. It's a great question, and I've thought a lot about it. What I was trying to describe was the degree to which the world really, for the last 30 years really, has been moving in this one fundamental direction, which is that non-Western countries have been gaining power and strength. China 30 years ago was 1% of global GDP. Today it's 17% of global GDP. India was not even 1%, was 0.5%. It's now 4%, so it's like 8 times larger as a share of the global economy. Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, all these countries. And that what I was saying is that fundamentally changes the nature of the international system, because these countries that used to be totally unimportant, that you didn't have to worry about, are now actors on the international stage. I think that fundamental dynamic is still true. And you can see that even in the response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the most important thing the US has been able to do is to keep Europe on board, to in a sense create a unified approach. In the old days, think even just of the Iraq War, which is only 20 years ago, the US did what it wanted to do. What countries could come along? Okay, great. The attitude of Washington was, if you want to support us, great. We're going to do this anyway, and we will prevail anyway, right? That attitude has fundamentally changed. I think that even in the US, they understand the only strength that comes is from this alliance of countries, because the US is no longer what it was. Look, the US was, in the middle of the 1990s, the US was 30% of global GDP. It's now about 22. So it's not a huge fall, but you know what? The line is going in that direction. Now, I think the really interesting question here is, can this alliance of liberal countries replace what the US used to do? The US was the kind of liberal guarantor of the world. And before it, in some ways, Britain played that role. So what we're trying to figure out in this new world we're going into is, can you have a collection of liberal-minded countries that play the same role? Can they stay united? Can they cooperate? Europe, US, Japan, South Korea, Canada, Australia, it's a large group. Together, by the way, they add up to about 65% of the world economy, about 80% of global defense spending. So yes, it's very sad that you don't have all Africa and a lot of those other countries, but the power is still mostly among the liberal democratic states.
At the same time, we know that amazingly, somehow Putin is popular in many countries of the world, because they don't care what he does. A lot of people in Brazil, in Africa, in South Asia, in Latin America, they just know that he is against Americans, and they consider him to be the anti-American leader. So, remembering another piece of yours, you wrote, why they hate us after 9/11. Do you understand why they hate us? Why they hate America that much that they choose Putin, not the liberal world?
Look, I think we do understand it. Fundamentally, when you are that powerful, you always inspire certain kind of opposition, particularly among the less powerful, because they look at you and they say, our world is totally determined by what you do. You sneeze and we all get a cold. And then they tend to think of conspiracy theories, that you're doing these things because, there's all these plots. I mean, this is true even within America. In the faraway parts of America, people think everyone in New York and Washington is part of some big conspiracy theory. So it's a kind of suspicion of great power.
And COVID was created.
Exactly, Russia has this very much, because Moscow is at the center, and the further away you go, everyone thinks everything in Moscow is a conspiracy. So part of it is that dynamic, that you're never going to, in a world where power matters, the most powerful guy is not going to be loved by everyone. There's going to be a certain amount of suspicion, And there's always a market for the challenger, for the person who defies, I remember being struck by this growing up in India. The prime minister when I was growing up was this woman, Indira Gandhi. Very powerful, tough-minded person. She kind of ruined the Indian economy. She was not particularly good as a leader. She was not politically she created all kinds of problems at home. She caused there to be insurrections in 5 different parts of India. Eventually, one of those insurrections resulted in her being assassinated by her own bodyguards. But she was very popular for standing up against the Americans. Now, to me, this was always odd because India is actually very pro-American. Like when you look at the polls, it's like Israel, Poland, and India are the most pro-American. If you ask people, do you like American culture? Do you like American business? Do you like American brands? But the idea that our leader could stand up to the 800-pound gorilla in the world was very popular. And people loved the fact that she stood up to Nixon and she stood up to Kissinger. So there's a certain dynamic where, I call it the Che Guevara effect. Che was mostly a total failure. None of the revolutions he tried to produce worked anywhere. But people saw him as this, he's willing to stand up to power. And so I'll put his face on my T-shirt.
Yeah, but for some time, the Western alliance is strong enough and economically strong enough to be that leading force. But do you expect that balance could change and probably like China and the global South can become that economically strong to be the real threat to the Western alliance, to the liberal order?
Yes, I mean, you're 100% right. The long-term challenge, I wouldn't even call it a threat right now, but the long-term challenge to the liberal order is that you are slowly and steadily getting a larger and larger number of countries that are growing powerful and strong, but are not fundamentally liberal in their orientation. This is what I was trying to get at in the post-American world. China, most importantly, but as you say, I mean, is Brazil fundamentally a liberal country? Is Indonesia fundamentally a liberal country? I mean, in values and outlook. There are liberal elements within each of those countries, just as there are liberal elements within Russia. But, in each one there's a balance. Each country almost has its own version of the Slavophiles versus the Westerners. And it's not clear who is winning out. So a lot, I think, will depend on, as these societies develop, which of those parts of the society become more dominant. Because if you look at a country like South Korea or Japan or Singapore, which have become, fully modern in terms of economic, and they have also become quite liberal in their orientation, particularly toward world order, toward wanting a rules-based international system, wanting an open international system. Will that happen as India becomes richer? Will that happen as Indonesia? I hope so, because that has to be the hope for the liberal world, because otherwise, you're right. It is inevitable that the Western world's power over time will shrink. Why? Because it is 9% of the world's population. And right now, the Western world is 50% of the global GDP. America is 4% of the world's population and 22% of global GDP. Ultimately, you're going to have, maybe it doesn't go down all the way to 4, but it's not going to be 5-6 times its population. So that adjustment is taking place already. And we have to hope, we liberals have to hope, that as these countries modernize, they also liberalize.
Do I get it right that you are not afraid anymore for liberalism in America, and you think that the threat of Trump and Trumpism is fading away?
I wouldn't put it that way. I've always felt that America has stronger institutions than than the worst case scenario that people have. But I do think the way I would put it is this. that liberal democracy is actually quite fragile. If you look back to the ancient world, to the extent that we have examples, Greece and things like that, these were very short-lived. They always collapsed. And they almost always collapsed for one of two reasons: war or demagogues. So it's a very familiar pattern that happens. And the way you ensure that democracy does not become as fragile and liberalism does not get destroyed is you have to stay very conscious of the fragility of the experiment, and there has to be a very strong commitment to democratic norms. I say norms, meaning just customs, practices, beliefs, because we all talk too much about institutions, as though these institutions are, up there made by God and will just stand. Institutions in a political system are just men and women. If they don't act honorably, if they don't act with the right values, those institutions will collapse. I mean, you can see that, in America we saw that, which is Trump tried to essentially overturn the election. And then there were a lot of individuals who had positions of power where they had to sign off on the vote counts. They could have just signed on and, in Trump's direction. Instead, they all upheld the actual vote counts. Now, that's not some institution handed down by God. That was those individuals making choices. And so if you don't have people who have values, who have commitment, who put liberal principles above personal power, I don't know that democracy can survive, or any system can survive. So that's the thing I worry about, which is it's always fragile, because it does depend to a certain extent on individual virtue. It's not just a system like Montesquieu and these people thought. It's not as though it's just all like a mechanical clock, that everything just works by magic. No, there are people there who have to be committed to liberal democracy.
That's very interesting, because is it predetermined or not? Do nations have that kind of democratic destiny? Because what you have just said, that's the problem of Russian democracy. Yeah. The problem is that men and women, sometimes they are school teachers, or just they work in municipalities or somewhere else. They go to the polling stations and they just get all those elections falsified. They commit that huge crime of electoral fraud. And they have to do it. They are told by their boss, and they prefer not to be fired, but to commit that crime, and that is being repeated again and again and again. How can we somehow break that vicious circle, or how could it happen, for example, in India, where people just remain idealistic and do not commit all those crimes?
It's a huge question. So I think that if you look historically, the way that it has developed, a democracy has developed largely because you had some rule-based way to contest the power of the state. So in the West, first you had the battle between the king and the lords, the aristocrats, and that created some separation of power. Then you had the contest between the king and the church, and that created, most famously with the Reformation, that created, in each of these contests, what happens is you're creating space for individual liberty, because the king's powers are a little bit constrained by Magna Carta, for example. Magna Carta in 1215 is basically, it's not like anything good for common people, but it basically tells the king you can't take the aristocrats' land, the barons, and then you have the whole emphasis in the Reformation that the church is protected. That produces then over centuries a culture of a certain kind of restraint and the rise of individual liberties. But then you ask yourself, well, what about the rest of the world, as you say? What about in India? What about in Indonesia? Well, I think what's happened in those places is exactly this, that good leadership has recognized that, we don't have the history that produced by some kind of almost miracle or coincidence liberal democracy in the Western world. But we can try to put these principles into place, and we can try to maintain them. And it's hard. India went through 2 years of emergency rule, martial law. Many democracies have failed in Africa, but there are those that have kept going. And I do think that leadership in those cases has been very important. Let me give you a simple example I think about sometimes with Russia. Just imagine if two things had been different. One, if Yeltsin had not reacted as he did to the Chechen war and had just said, fine, you want to be independent? It's like one of the poorest parts of Russia. God bless you. Go. We will create a successful nation without Chechnya. Number one. Two, imagine if one of the preceding 4 prime ministers had become president. People forget that Putin was not Yeltsin's first choice. Yeltsin's first choice was Chernomyrdin, who was then turned down by the Duma because he was seen to have a communist past. Then Primakov actually tries Chernomyrdin twice. Then Primakov. And
Primakov actually was criticized for being KGB man.
Exactly. Then all these people were being criticized by the liberals because Chernomyrdin and Primakov were both maybe not
was great.
So imagine if Chernomyrdin had been there. I think he would have been a completely different kind of. And by the way, he would have died in 6 or 7 years, as we now know, creating the need for an orderly succession, right? So that we would have had transfer of power. But then Kiriyenko comes in after Primakov. And then because of all the debt default and all the economic crisis, finally they're looking around and they see this guy who seems to be pretty competent, and Putin wants his family.
There was also Aksyonenko between
the Putin family and
who was not appointed but had to be appointed.
So, to my mind, you take those two things that happened in the 1990s. One, imagine if Chernomyrdin had just been, and two, they had not gone crazy on the Chechen war. I think Russia could have had there was a very reasonable chance that Russia could have developed in a very different way. Russia has this historical problem, which is too much power at the center. I mean, as you know, the Tsar almost owned the entire country. So even the nobles in Russia were never very powerful in the way that the nobles in England or in Germany were powerful. They didn't have their own fiefdoms, their own. So there was too much power concentrated at the top. But I think that, again, a good leader would have created more decentralized power, would have allowed, a certain amount of pluralism, if not democracy. Would Russia be a liberal democracy if those two things had happened? No, but I think it would be a much more liberal country, and it would be much more open. People forget. You obviously have lived this, but Russia in the 1990s, there was the chaos of the oligarchs' capitalism, but there was an amazing free press in Russia. There were amazing civic organizations that had grown. Russians liked that open society that they were creating. There was enormous energy,
and that made me and people like me very optimistic about our future. Right. And our optimism is that from February 24th. Right.
Well, because what has happened, unfortunately, is the state got rebuilt with oil money, and oil and natural gas and things like that. And as the state got built again, all the old Russian history started to return. With the power of the center, the power of the Tsar, and fortunately, the civil society, which was building, and I was very hopeful about, because if you looked at Russian civil society in 1999, when Putin comes into power, among new democracies, Russia had one of the strongest civil societies, and then Putin decided, slowly but surely, to kill it.
So. How do you see the future Russian landscape after the war, after Putin? Should it be decentralized? Should it be divided into several parts for its own best?
Look, Russia is a huge country, as you know. I mean, it's the largest country in the world by far in terms of landmass. I think that there is, however, you tell me if I'm right, my sense is culturally, there is a very strong sense of Russia as a country. People have a real commitment to it. There is a single literature, there is the single culture, there is the Orthodox Church that is at the heart of it. So it is a country. I don't think I would not be in favor of dividing up Russia as a country. But I do think it needs to be governed in a very different way, in a much more decentralized way. I think there has to be some way to break that stranglehold that Moscow has. Because when you're governing a country that large from one city, the amount of power you have to centralize is so great. And the degree to which people out there are given no share in their future, it makes everybody almost like subjects rather than citizens. And I think the key has to be to find a way to make Russians feel that they are citizens of their own country, that they own it, that they are part of the whole enterprise. Tocqueville used to say when he came to America, the thing that struck him most was that you'd go to a town in America, and if they didn't have a library, they wouldn't wait for Washington to send money to set up a library, to have the government do it. They would just start a library. The group of people would get together, put a little money together, and they'd start a library. That idea of bottom-up governance rather than top-down, I think that could happen in Russia. My experience in Russia is very much one of a culture that is very, it's a big, rich, Western-oriented culture, I would say. I mean, the culture of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Tchaikovsky and all that, you feel it in Russia, and it's a very warm country. But you do always feel this oppressive sense of the center.
How long do you think that curse of Putin's war would last? And how long Russia is going to be treated and considered as the evil empire?
I don't see a scenario soon for this ending, unfortunately. I think that what is likely to happen is we're going to end up in some kind of a stalemate. The Ukrainians are doing that. We're speaking now in late November. I think the Ukrainians have done an amazing job, heroically resisting this brutal aggression, and also the way it's being done. Bombing of power plants so that people don't have light and heat. Bombing of civilian residential areas so that civilians are living in fear. They are resisting this very well, but they're not going to be able to reclaim all of Donbass. They're not going to be able to take back Crimea. The Russian army is dug into those areas. They will be able to hold them, I think. One of the things we don't talk about in the West as much, there are parts of Ukraine, there are parts of Donbass that are pro-Russian, that are Russian-speaking. Those places have people who perhaps thought the Ukrainian government was discriminating against them because they weren't allowing them to use the Russian language. And all this has been exaggerated by Russian state media, but there is a truth that there are parts of the Donbass, and certainly Crimea, which have that character, and the Russians will be able to hold those, I think. So they will lose a lot of what they took since February, but they will be able to hold what they took in 2014. So that means there will be a stalemate. And at that point, the question is, are either side willing to make the real compromises that will get you a settlement? I don't see Mr. Putin being able to do that. And honestly, Zelensky, it's difficult because the Ukrainians have lost so much that they feel like they cannot make concessions to what they see.
Ukrainian society doesn't want any compromise.
Exactly. So if both sides can't compromise, you can imagine some kind of a de facto ceasefire. But it's difficult to imagine a peace settlement. And the sanctions will only come off, I think, if there is a peace settlement. So I think Russia is going to be isolated from the world economy and from the world for a while, for a long time. I mean, I think that's, and then the question is what happens internally in Russia. I don't have a good sense of that, but my own reading is that Putin has really set up a system of such total control for himself personally. It's difficult to see how it would be easy to dislodge him. I mean, think about this. If Xi Jinping were to die tomorrow, we know what would happen. We know the institutions, the procedures, the standing committee of the Politburo would get together. They would vote. They would elect somebody new. That person would become general secretary of the party and president of the country. If the king of Saudi Arabia dies tomorrow, we know exactly what would happen, as the crown prince would become king. What happens if Putin dies? Nobody knows. There are no institutions, there are no practices, there's no norms, there's no structure of authority. So this whole country, one of the most powerful countries in the world, with nuclear weapons, with a veto in the Security Council, it's all, he described it once as a vertical of power. Mm-hmm. And it really does feel like that, like there's this one guy. And he's designed it like that because he wants there to be no challenge to his authority.
And now we come to the question of the nuclear war. How come that system could exist when the nuclear bomb and like the perspective of the nuclear war depends only on one person who happens to be, as Angela Merkel said, out of touch with reality?
You know, part of it, I think, dates back to the Soviet era, where both in China and in Russia, one thing that communism did was it made sure that the military was always under civilian control, under the Communist Party's control. They were always fearful of the idea of the military becoming the key player. So, you know, as you know, in every division in the army, there was always Communist Party. So the party always had that control. Putin, when he rebuilt the army in the 2000s, he didn't quite do the same thing, but he made the army very much a part of his personal apparatus. He did not ever give generals enormous power. He always made sure that the army was, in his case, it was the FSB that became the core of Putin's power comes from the FSB. All the people he appointed were former FSB people. So in a sense, for Putin, the FSB is his Communist Party. It's his institutional mechanism of control. So the army doesn't, you would think that the army would have procedures and institutions, particularly around custody and use of nuclear weapons. I hope that's the case. We don't know very much. We knew what it was actually, ironically, we knew more about it under the Soviet period. Because of arms control, there was a lot of discussion and sharing of information about how do you maintain your arsenal, how do we make sure there's no accident. Under Putin's rule, we don't have any idea. And what we do know is scary, because we know that, for example, he has his own presidential guard that he has set up since 2016. So there he has, again, within the military, he has his own almost kind of elite. So what does that mean? Do they have a special powers in the nuclear area? We don't know.
We have seen that American authorities and the CIA actually did very good job in predicting the war in Ukraine and in warning Ukrainian officials and the whole world about what is happening and what Putin is planning to do. Do you think that Americans can do the same good job in like preventing the nuclear war in not to say toppling Putin, but trying to get control over him?
I think it's much harder because there's much shorter time. I mean, let's assume we're talking about a worst case scenario of the use of an actual nuclear weapon, not a tactical one, not a dirty bomb, but an actual. The time period is so short. This is why the world lived under this fear for so long. I mean, you're talking about 20 minutes. between the time the order is given and the time the missile is launched, maybe even less sometimes, and then it's another 15 or 20 minutes by the time the missile hits.
But we don't believe in that.
I don't think that's likely to happen. Look, let me be clear. I actually think Putin will not use them, because I think Putin is, I don't want to use the word rational, because people when they hear the word rational, they think I mean reasonable.
Yeah.
I don't mean reasonable. What I mean is...
He has done a lot that doesn't seem to be rational.
Exactly. What I mean is he does balance costs and benefits. He's looking at them all the time. In the case of Ukraine, clearly he totally miscalculated what the costs would be and what the benefits would be. In other words, he thought he would get to Kyiv very quickly, he'd overthrow the government, the West would not impose much punishment. Looking at 2014, he thought it'll be another version of that. So he got it all wrong. But you see what I'm saying is it wasn't like mad, crazy. He was making a judgment about costs and benefits. Every time in the past when he had done these, the costs had been low and the benefits had been great for him. Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Syria, Ukraine in 2014. So he had in a sense been given the impression, maybe by the West, that he had the green light. I think that in this case, what's very good about this talk about nuclear weapons is he has heard from a lot of people, from U.S., from Europe. This would be a red line that if you crossed, the world would not be the same again. And I think Putin understands that in that situation, he doesn't gain that much, even from using a tactical nuclear weapon. Tactical nuclear weapons are not that powerful. You can do as much damage with bombardment as with the tactical nuclear weapon. But the image of using the nuclear weapon, probably China would break with him, or at least criticize him. India would break with him. It'd be hard for countries like South Africa and Brazil to say. So he knows that there would be a potential huge price. And what would be the benefit? Look, if you look at the city of Mariupol, the estimates that I've seen are that the Russian army, between bombardment and artillery and things, has killed 1 out of every 4 people in that city. The city had 450,000 people. The estimates are 120,000 people have been killed. You can do a lot of damage, unfortunately, just using conventional weapons. You don't. So what would
you don't need the bomb to get?
Unfortunately, the truth is America killed more people in Japan with the aerial bombardments than they did with the nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yeah. Okay, and let's try to imagine the post-war world. What could that great peace look like? Because we had several great peaces in the world history. Some of them were good, like Westphalia, Vienna, Potsdam, and some of them, like Versailles, were not very good. How do you see that post-war, post-Putin great peace?
So I think there are 2 elements that are very important in it. One, that this aggression cannot be in any way rewarded or justified, or Putin cannot get away with this, because that would create a completely dangerous dynamic for world order. What are the Chinese going to think when they look at Taiwan? What is Iran going to think when it looks at its neighbors, right? If people believe that you can get away with this kind of aggression toward a weaker neighbor, I think that takes a fundamental cornerstone of the post-1945 world order, and it destroys it. Most people don't realize, but since 1945, there have been very few acts of this kind of naked aggression that have been able to be sustained and incorporated. Borders have not changed with force. It's extraordinary, really, because if you look back over the 75 years before 1945, hundreds of borders changed by force. So this is a very core principle that it's very important not to undermine. So no rewarding of aggression. But secondly, I would say, you have to find a way to allow everybody to feel that there was some kind of accommodation to their national interests. So I think, to me, that translates into, you cannot totally humiliate Russia as a country. Putin as a person is separate from Russia as a country. So there has to be some effort eventually to draw Russia back into the international system, to give it a place of honor. I think this is not so hard, because Russia is a very powerful part of the international system. It has a veto on the Security Council. It's involved in every, so it would be a question of rehabilitating a Russia as long as it would renounce this act of aggression. But I do think that it's important for us to think about a post-Putin Russia, because I don't believe that there's anything, genetic or even civilizational about Russia that makes it hard for it to be a part of the modern world. Look, in those optimistic days of the 1990s that you were talking about, I wrote a column for Newsweek arguing that Russia should be offered membership in NATO, which I truly believed, because I thought, if NATO is going to expand and become this larger collective security organization, then why not say to the Russians, if you meet these conditions, of further and further liberalization, and is Russia any less Western than Hungary? If you look at Russia's contributions to Western civilization, I would say is a lot stronger, actually, than Hungary. So we should have that as an ultimate aspiration, that we have a place for Russia in the liberal Western order, because I do believe that it has that capacity, and I think it would be a mistake for us to go down this path of assuming that it is forever doomed.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you for your time.
Pleasure.